The richest man in the room asked me one question, and everyone expected me to give the wrong answer. I still remember the soft clink of crystal glasses, the smell of fresh rosemary drifting from the kitchen, and the quiet hum of expensive conversations filling Romano's Italian steakhouse that Friday night. I had worked there for almost 3 years, long enough to recognize every kind of customer before they even opened the menu. The anniversary couples held hands. Business executives never looked up from their phones. Influencers photographed their food before tasting it. And then there were the people who carried power without ever asking for attention. They didn't need to. The room simply shifted around them. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, 5'6", proudly plus-sized, and a waitress who has learned that strangers usually decide who you are before you say your first word. Some assumed I wasn't disciplined because of my body. Others thought I lacked confidence. A few offered fake sympathy wrapped inside compliments that somehow felt worse than insults. I stopped trying to prove them wrong a long time ago. Instead, I smiled, served great food, remembered birthdays, memorized favorite wine orders, and let consistency speak louder than appearances. That evening started like every other busy Friday. The dining room was completely booked. The waiting list stretched nearly an hour. My feet already ached after covering almost 7 miles according to the fitness watch on my wrist, and I still had 4 hours left before closing. My manager hurried between tables while the kitchen bell chimed every few seconds. Then everything changed without anyone announcing it. The front doors opened. Conversations didn't stop, but they softened. Heads turned without being obvious about it. Even the bartenders instinctively straightened their posture. Adrian Romano had arrived. I'd heard his name before, just like everyone else in Chicago. Successful investor, owner of several luxury hotels, real estate developer, a man surrounded by stories nobody could ever confirm. He entered wearing a charcoal suit that fit as though it had been made only for him. 3 associates followed behind him, dressed just as sharply, but somehow less noticeable. Adrian didn't walk quickly. He never needed to. Confidence had its own pace. My manager whispered my name. Emily, table 12 is yours. I grabbed 4 leather menus and walked toward them, reminding myself they were simply guests like everyone else. As I approached, Adrian looked up from the wine list. His gray eyes met mine for barely a second before returning to the menu. No smirk, no judgment, no lingering stare at my size. Just one calm glance. Oddly, that felt more respectful than anything I'd experienced all week. I welcomed them, described the chef's specials, answered 2 questions about the dry-aged ribeye, and recommended a local bourbon that paired well with it. Adrian listened without interrupting. His associates ordered immediately, but he remained silent until I finished writing everything down. Then he closed the menu, folded his hands, looked directly into my eyes, and asked in a voice so calm the entire table seemed to stop breathing. Emily, if someone handed you $1 million tonight, would you quit this job tomorrow? I looked at Adrian for a moment, wondering if I had heard him correctly. $1 million. The numbers sounded unreal floating above white tablecloths and polished silverware. His 3 associates watched me with quiet curiosity, almost as if they had already placed invisible bets on my answer. I smiled politely and tucked my order pad beneath my arm. No, I said. I would not quit. One of the men actually laughed. Another raised an eyebrow. Adrian didn't either. He simply continued looking at me with the same calm expression. Most people would, he said. Maybe, I replied. But money solves bills. It does not decide who I want to be tomorrow morning. The dining room seemed louder again, yet our little corner felt strangely still. I could hear the soft notes of the piano near the bar and the gentle hiss of steaks finishing on the grill. My heart beat faster than usual, but not because I was intimidated. I simply wanted to return to work before another table needed something. Adrian rested one hand beside his water glass. You enjoy carrying heavy trays for strangers? His question sounded genuine rather than mocking. I laughed quietly. Not every part of the job. My feet definitely disagree by the end of a Friday night. That earned the smallest smile from one of his associates. Then why stay? Adrian asked. I glanced around the restaurant. Table 6 was celebrating a 50th wedding anniversary. A young father at table 9 was helping his little daughter color the children's menu. An elderly gentleman near the window waved at me because he needed another cup of decaf coffee before I even reached him. Because every job has hard moments. I answered. This one also has good ones. I know which regular likes extra lemons with her iced tea. I know which veteran sits alone every Tuesday because his wife used to love this place. I know that little girl over there always asks for 2 cherries with her Shirley Temple. Those things matter to me. Adrian followed my eyes across the room without saying anything. If I accepted $1 million just so I could walk away tomorrow, I would be leaving people who count on me without even saying goodbye. That is not the kind of person I want to become. His associates exchanged another glance. One of them leaned back in his chair, studying me as though I had answered a question from an interview instead of a dinner conversation. Adrian folded his napkin with careful precision. Interesting, he said softly. Most people believe money buys freedom. I nodded. Sometimes it does. But freedom without purpose becomes another kind of empty. Before he could respond, my manager appeared beside the table with an apologetic smile. Emily, table 4 needs you. I excused myself and walked away, expecting the conversation to end there. As I delivered another basket of warm bread and refilled 3 iced teas, I could still feel Adrian's eyes following the rhythm of my work, not with admiration or suspicion, but with the quiet focus of a man who had asked one simple question and somehow received an answer he had never expected to hear. The rest of the night moved like a slow current, pulling me in different directions at once. I kept my focus on the tables in front of me, balancing plates, refilling glasses, and repeating the same polite phrases I had used 1,000 times before, yet I could still feel that strange weight of attention coming from table 12. It was not the kind of attention I was used to. It did not feel like judgment, and it did not feel like desire either. It felt like observation, as if someone had paused the world for a moment just to study how I moved through it. When I returned to their table with fresh water, Adrian Romano was no longer speaking with his associates. They were quietly reviewing something on a tablet, but he was watching the flow of the restaurant again, his eyes tracking details most people would never notice. You move differently than most servers, he said without looking at me directly. I almost laughed. I have been told I walk too fast when I am busy. That is not what I mean, he replied calmly. I hesitated, unsure if I should respond or simply continue working. There was something about the way he spoke that made every sentence feel like it carried more weight than it should. I placed the water pitcher down gently. Then what do you mean? Adrian finally looked at me again. You do not apologize when you speak, not even when you are serving. That caught me off guard. I had never thought about it. I simply nodded. I do not see why I should apologize for doing my job well. One of his associates leaned slightly toward him. She is confident, he said quietly. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his glass and turned it slowly in his hand, as if considering something unseen. I excused myself and moved toward table 9, where the elderly man I recognized from every Tuesday raised his hand before I even arrived. Same as usual? I asked. He smiled. You know me too well, Emily. As I walked back toward the kitchen, I noticed Adrian watching that interaction as well. It was subtle, but different from before. Less analytical, more focused. I spent the next hour moving between tables, yet I could still feel that presence anchored in the center of the room, steady and unchanging. When I finally slowed for a brief moment near the service station, my coworker Sarah leaned in. Do you know who that is? She whispered, glancing toward table 12. I followed her gaze. Adrian was still sitting exactly as he had been when he arrived, but now he was alone at the table. His associates had stepped away. He is just a customer, I said. Sarah let out a quiet laugh. That is not just a customer. That is Adrian Romano. My cousin works in downtown finance. People say he does not waste time on anything that does not interest him. I frowned slightly. He ordered food like everyone else. He owns half the city, she said. People like that do not usually spend their Friday nights asking waitresses questions about their life choices. I looked back at him again, unsure why the conversation suddenly felt heavier. Adrian raised his eyes at that exact moment, meeting mine across the room. He did not smile. He simply held my gaze for a brief second, then returned to his drink as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had changed. I could feel it, like a door that had quietly shifted from closed to slightly open without making a sound. The moment I looked away from Adrian Romano, I tried to convince myself that nothing about him mattered beyond that table, that question, and the strange silence it had left behind. But by the time my shift ended near 11:30 at night, I realized I had been wrong about that. The last hour of work blurred into routine motions, wiping down tables, balancing receipts, and counting tips in the small back room while the kitchen lights dimmed and the restaurant slowly emptied. Yet even after I changed out of my uniform and stepped into the cool Chicago night air, I felt as if something unseen had quietly followed me out of the building. Across the street, a black vehicle I did not recognize remained parked with its engine running low, its windows too dark to see inside. I told myself it was just coincidence and started walking toward the bus stop, pulling my jacket tighter as the wind moved through the nearly empty street. Inside the vehicle, Adrian Romano watched without moving. He did not speak for a long moment, simply observing as I checked the bus schedule on my phone, standing under a flickering streetlight, waiting like thousands of other workers in the city. One of his associates finally broke the silence. "You want us to continue the background review?" he asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on me as I stepped onto the arriving bus, the doors closing between me and the night. "Yes," he said finally, his voice calm and measured. Everything. What followed was not loud or dramatic. It was precise, quiet, and almost unsettling in its simplicity. Files were reviewed, records were checked, and patterns were traced through ordinary systems that most people never thought about twice. By the time I reached my small apartment on the edge of the city, Adrian already knew more about me than I would have ever expected a stranger to know. He learned that I worked mornings at the restaurant and evenings at a small community cafe 3 blocks from a university campus. He learned that I often stayed late not because I was asked to, but because I helped other servers finish their sections when they were overwhelmed. He learned that I sent part of my tips every week to a clinic that provided free meals to families who could not afford them. Nothing about it made sense to him at first. In his world, effort was usually tied to reward, and kindness often came with expectations attached. But what he saw in me did not follow that structure. The next evening, I arrived at the cafe where I worked my second job, still tired from the night before. It was a smaller place, quieter, filled with students typing on laptops and early commuters grabbing coffee before class. I tied my apron and began my shift as usual, unaware that across the street, a familiar black vehicle had once again taken position in silence. Adrian watched as I carried trays between tables, smiling at customers who barely looked up from their phones, refilling coffee without being asked, and pausing to help an elderly woman who had dropped her napkin on the floor. There was no performance in it, no awareness of being observed. It was simply how I moved through the world. For the first time in a long time, Adrian Romano found himself uncertain. Not about business, not about strategy, but about something far more unfamiliar. Because everything he had seen in his life had taught him to measure people by what they wanted, yet I seemed to want less for myself and more for everyone else around me. And that realization did not give him answers. It only made him ask a new question he had not expected, one that stayed with him long after the city lights blurred into the night. By the third day after that strange question at the restaurant, my life had already settled back into its usual rhythm, or at least I tried to convince myself it had. I woke up before sunrise, took the early bus across Chicago, and started my shift at the cafe with the same routine I had repeated for years. Coffee orders, pastry trays, quick smiles, polite conversations that lasted no longer than necessary. Yet something subtle had shifted in the way I moved through the world. It was not something I could point to directly, only a feeling that I was being noticed in a way I had never experienced before. Not judged, not dismissed, but observed with patience. I did not know it yet, but Adrian Romano had not stopped thinking about me since that night. From a private office high above the city, he reviewed more than just basic reports. He watched patterns, habits, choices. He learned that I arrived at the cafe every morning exactly 12 minutes early, even when my shift did not require it. He noticed I always cleaned tables myself even when bus staff were available. He noticed I never left a coworker struggling alone, even when I was already behind. And he noticed something else that did not fit neatly into any financial model or behavioral profile he had ever studied. I was consistent in places where there was no reward. On the fourth day, I arrived at the cafe to find my manager unusually tense. She kept glancing toward the front windows, adjusting her apron more than necessary. "There is someone asking about you," she said quietly when I stepped behind the counter. I frowned slightly. "A customer?" She hesitated. "He did not order anything." He just asked if you were working today. Before I could respond, I felt it. That same stillness I had felt at the restaurant days ago. I turned slowly toward the front of the cafe. Adrian Romano was standing near the entrance, dressed differently this time, more casual, but still impossible to ignore. He did not move immediately. He simply looked at me as if confirming something he already suspected. The cafe around him continued as normal, but everything near the door felt slightly displaced, like the air itself had shifted. I stepped forward cautiously, wiping my hands on a towel. "This is not exactly your usual place," I said, trying to sound normal. "Neither was the restaurant," he replied calmly. There was no entourage this time, no associates, no visible security. Just him. I glanced toward the customers seated nearby, then back at him. "Are you here for coffee?" A faint expression passed across his face, something between curiosity and restraint. "I am here because I needed to see something again." I did not understand what that meant, but I felt the weight of it anyway. I poured him a simple black coffee, because it was the only thing I could think to offer that would make the moment feel normal. When I placed it on the counter, he did not immediately take it. Instead, he looked around the cafe slowly, watching the way I interacted with customers, the way I refilled sugar packets without being asked, the way I smiled at a student who looked overwhelmed by his laptop screen. "You do not change depending on who is watching you," he said finally. I paused. "Is that unusual?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he finally took the coffee and held it without drinking. "In my world, yes," he said quietly. I leaned slightly against the counter, unsure whether I should continue the conversation. "In your world," I repeated, "what do people usually do?" His gaze lifted slightly, meeting mine again. "They adjust. They perform. They calculate outcomes before they act." I shook my head slightly. That sounds exhausting. For the first time, something like genuine curiosity crossed his expression. Not about business, not about power, about me. And in that moment, I realized that whatever game he thought he was playing before, it was no longer the same game at all. The next morning arrived with the same gray Chicago light filtering through my apartment window, but something in me felt slightly unsettled, as if the world I knew had developed a thin crack I could not quite explain. I still went to work at the cafe as usual, still tied my apron, still greeted customers with the same practiced smile, yet my mind kept returning to the man who had stood across from me the day before holding a cup of coffee, as if it carried more weight than it should. Adrian Romano had not asked for my number. He had not made any demands. He had simply observed, listened, and left with a quiet expression that stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. By mid-morning, I noticed something unusual outside the cafe. A black vehicle was parked across the street again, subtle enough that most people would not notice it unless they were looking for it. I told myself it was coincidence, just another car in a busy city block, but when I looked again 10 minutes later, it was still there. Inside the cafe, everything continued normally. Students argued softly over assignments. A couple shared a pastry near the window, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Yet I found myself glancing outside more than once, a habit I did not recognize in myself. When I stepped out during my short break to take out the trash, I finally saw him clearly. Adrian was standing a few steps away from the vehicle, not hidden, not rushed, simply present, as if he had always belonged exactly where he was. I stopped walking, unsure why my body reacted before my thoughts could form. "You are not working at the restaurant today," he said calmly, as if continuing a conversation we had paused. I adjusted my grip on the trash bag slightly. People usually call before they appear outside someone's workplace. There was no irritation in my voice, only confusion. He nodded once. "That would be the usual expectation." I frowned. "Then why are you here?" He took a moment before answering, as if choosing words he rarely used. "Because I wanted to understand something I cannot explain from a distance." I let out a small breath of disbelief. "You are a very busy man to be standing outside a cafe in the middle of the morning just to understand a waitress." For the first time, something almost like hesitation crossed his expression. "That is exactly why it matters." I looked at him more carefully then, really looked, noticing how different he seemed outside the structured world of his restaurant table. There were no formal boundaries here, no polished environment, no audience to observe. Yet he still carried the same quiet control, as if the world adjusted itself around his presence regardless of location. "What exactly are you trying to understand?" I asked. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes steady, unreadable. Why someone who has every reason to want more does not seem interested in taking it. The question caught me off guard. I leaned slightly against the brick wall of the cafe, thinking for a moment before answering. Maybe because I already have enough to be useful, I said simply. I do not need more to justify my life. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked past me toward the cafe window, watching the movement inside as if trying to connect pieces that did not align with what he expected. That is not a common answer, he finally said. I shrugged slightly. Maybe it should be. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The city noise continued around us, cars passing, distant voices, the rhythm of an ordinary morning that felt oddly suspended between two people who should not have crossed paths this often. Then Adrian stepped back slightly, as if concluding something internal. I will not interrupt your work again, he said. I nodded slowly. That would be appreciated. He turned toward the black vehicle, but before getting in, he paused and looked back once more. Emily Carter, he said quietly, as if testing the sound of my name. I tilted my head slightly. Yes. His expression remained calm, but something beneath it had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Most people try to impress me, he said. You do not. And then he left. I stood there for a long moment after the car disappeared into traffic, unsure why the air felt different than it had before, as if something had begun moving in a direction neither of us had fully chosen yet. That night, I could not stop thinking about the way he had said my name before leaving, as if it carried more meaning than I had ever attached to it. I told myself it was ridiculous to let a single conversation disturb my focus. Yet even while I prepared ingredients for the next morning at home, my thoughts kept drifting back to Adrian Romano. The next day at the cafe felt heavier, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I could no longer ignore the feeling that something beneath the surface had already shifted. I arrived early as always, tied my apron, and began wiping down tables before the first customers came in. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, I noticed the same black vehicle outside again, parked slightly farther down the street this time, as if trying not to be obvious while still remaining present. I did not need to look twice to know who was inside or nearby. My manager eventually noticed my distraction. You have been looking outside a lot lately, she said while passing me a stack of receipts. I forced a small smile. Just tired, I replied, though it was not entirely true. Around noon, the cafe was busy enough that I stopped thinking about it, moving between tables, taking orders, refilling drinks, and handling small requests that filled every corner of my attention. It was during a brief pause near the counter that I saw him again. Adrian had entered quietly, without announcement, without entourage, just like before. He stood near the entrance for a moment, observing the room as if confirming that it still functioned exactly as he expected. Then he walked toward the counter where I was standing. I felt my posture straighten instinctively, though I could not explain why. You said I do not interrupt your work, he said calmly as he stopped a few feet away. I placed a cup down carefully. That was the general idea. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a fact rather than responding to a comment. Then I will not take more than a moment. I leaned slightly against the counter, unsure whether to feel relieved or curious. You are already taking more than a moment, I said quietly. Something almost like a faint smile appeared, though it disappeared quickly. Fair observation. For a brief second, the noise of the cafe seemed to fade around us, not because it was actually silent, but because the space between his attention and mine felt unusually focused. Why are you here today? I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the dining area where a family was laughing over breakfast, then toward the window where sunlight reflected off the glass. Because I realized something, he said finally. The answer you gave me before was not calculated. It was immediate. I tilted my head slightly. It was just a question. For most people, he replied, questions are opportunities to present the best version of themselves. You answered without adjusting anything. I crossed my arms loosely. I did not know there was a performance expected. That time, he did smile faintly. Exactly. A customer called for a refill, and I instinctively turned to respond, but Adrian raised a hand slightly, not to stop me, but to acknowledge the interruption as natural. I quickly served the table and returned within a minute. When I came back, he was still there, waiting without impatience. You could leave, I said honestly. You have already asked your question. His eyes met mine steadily. I'm not sure I have. The statement lingered between us longer than I expected. I studied him for a moment, noticing something I had missed before, not coldness, not arrogance, but restraint, as if every interaction he had ever had was controlled by choice rather than impulse. Then ask it, I said. He hesitated for the first time since I had known him. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I noticed it. Why do you not change how you present yourself when you know you are being evaluated? The question was simpler than I expected, but heavier at the same time. I considered it while reaching for a towel to wipe the counter, grounding myself in something ordinary. Because I do not think I need to be different to be understood, I said. Adrian looked at me for a long moment, not responding immediately. Then he spoke quietly. Most people I meet spend their entire lives trying to be understood and still fail. I nodded slightly. Maybe they are trying too hard to be something instead of just being. He exhaled slowly, almost like he was processing something unfamiliar. Then, without warning, he stepped back slightly. Thank you for your time, he said simply. I blinked. That is it. For now, he replied. And then he left the same way he arrived, quietly, without drawing attention, but somehow leaving the entire space feeling different than it had before. I watched the door close behind him, unaware that whatever he was trying to understand about me was already beginning to change something far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. 2 days passed without Adrian Romano appearing at the cafe, and I told myself that whatever strange pattern had started forming between us had finally ended. Life returned to its usual rhythm: early mornings, long shifts, tired feet, and the constant sound of espresso machines steaming in the background. Yet even as I repeated the routine, I could not ignore the strange absence that now felt louder than his presence had ever been. It was almost as if the city itself had adjusted to his disappearance from my immediate world, but my thoughts had not. On the third morning, as I was arranging pastries behind the glass display, my manager called me into the back office with an unusual expression on her face. "There is someone here to see you," she said carefully. I frowned. "A customer complaint?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. He is waiting outside in a private vehicle. He asked for you specifically." My stomach tightened slightly before I even asked the obvious question. "Who is it?" She hesitated for a moment. "Adrian Romano." I closed my eyes briefly, more out of disbelief than concern. When I stepped outside through the side exit, I expected to see the same quiet presence I had become familiar with. Instead, I found something different. The black vehicle was there, but this time the door was open and Adrian was standing beside it, not observing from a distance, but waiting as if he already knew I would come. I stopped a few feet away from him, crossing my arms instinctively. "You said you would not interrupt my work again," I said. He nodded slightly. "I remember." I tilted my head. "Then this feels like an interruption." For the first time, there was a brief pause before he answered. "It is not about work today." That line changed the tone of everything immediately. I studied him more carefully than before. He looked the same as always, composed, controlled, but there was something quieter in his expression, something less procedural. "Then what is it about?" I asked. Adrian glanced briefly at the street before returning his attention to me. "I have spent years making decisions based on patterns, probability, and outcome efficiency," he said. "And every interaction I have had in the last week involving you does not fit any of those categories." I let out a small breath, half confusion and half disbelief. "Are you saying I am a problem you cannot solve?" A faint shift appeared in his expression, almost like amusement, but not quite. "I am saying you are not behaving like anyone I am used to encountering." I leaned slightly against the wall near the cafe entrance. "Maybe that is because I am not trying to be anyone you are used to." He nodded slowly, as if accepting that point without resistance. "That is precisely what I do not understand." A light breeze moved between us, carrying the sound of distant traffic and the faint smell of coffee from inside. I realized then that this conversation was different from all the previous ones. It was no longer about testing or observing. It was about something closer to uncertainty. "Why does it matter so much?" I asked quietly. Adrian looked at me for a long moment before responding. "Because I do not usually question what I already believe I understand." The honesty in that statement surprised me more than anything else he had said so far. I studied him for a moment, noticing how still he remained, not like someone trying to control the situation, but like someone trying to understand his own reaction to it. "Maybe you are not supposed to understand everything." I said finally. Maybe some people are not meant to be solved. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked away briefly toward the street, as if considering the weight of that idea. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Then what are they meant to be? I paused, unsure why the question felt heavier than it should. Maybe they are meant to be experienced, I said simply. For the first time since I had met him, Adrian did not respond right away. He just stood there, looking at me as if trying to decide whether that answer fit into any structure he had ever built in his mind. And in that silence, I realized something I had not expected. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something he was observing from a distance. He was already inside it. The next morning felt different even before I opened my eyes. It was not a change I could explain logically, but something in the atmosphere of my small apartment felt quieter, as if the world outside had adjusted itself overnight. I went through my usual routine anyway, preparing for work at the cafe, telling myself that whatever had happened between me and Adrian Romano was just a series of unusual conversations that meant nothing beyond the surface. But deep down, I already knew that was not true. When I arrived at the cafe that day, there was no black vehicle outside, no familiar presence waiting at a distance, and for the first time in days, I felt a strange emptiness instead of curiosity. The morning rush began quickly, pulling me back into the rhythm of orders, cups, and conversations. Hours passed without incident, until late afternoon, when my manager quietly informed me that someone had left something for me at the front counter. It was a simple white envelope with no return address. My name was written on it in clean, precise handwriting. Inside was not money, not a note of explanation, but a single printed page. At the top was a list of observations about my daily routine, the times I arrived at work, the routes I took, the places I stopped between shifts. I felt my breath slow as I read it again, realizing it was not intrusive in the way I initially feared. It was detailed, yes, but strangely neutral, almost clinical, as if documenting patterns rather than invading privacy. At the bottom of the page was a single sentence. I was wrong to assume understanding comes from distance. No signature, no explanation, just that. I stood there for a long moment behind the counter, holding the paper, trying to decide whether I felt unsettled or strangely understood. That evening, as I left the cafe after closing, I found him waiting not in a vehicle, but standing across the street under the soft glow of a streetlight. Adrian Romano did not approach immediately. He simply waited until I noticed him. When I finally crossed toward him, I stopped a few feet away. "Are you following me now?" I asked quietly. He shook his head once. No, a pause. "I am no longer observing from a distance." I folded my arms. That sounds like the same thing, with different wording. For the first time, he did not respond instantly. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "There is a difference. Observation is detached. This is not." I studied him carefully. "Then what is it?" The silence between us stretched longer than usual. The city moved around us, headlights passing, distant voices fading, but neither of us looked away. Finally, he said, "I have spent my entire life identifying patterns in people so I would not have to rely on uncertainty. You are the first person who does not behave like a pattern." I let out a small breath. That sounds like a complicated way of saying I am unpredictable. A faint expression crossed his face again, something almost like agreement. It is not a complaint. I looked away briefly toward the street, trying to steady my thoughts. "So what happens now?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step closer, not invading space, but closing the distance just enough that the conversation felt real instead of distant. "Now," he said quietly, "I stopped treating you like a question I need to solve." I turned back toward him, unsure what that meant exactly. "And what do you treat me as instead?" For the first time since I had met him, Adrian Romano did not have an immediate answer. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thoughtful, uncertain, almost human. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but different from before. "Someone I want to understand without control." The words hung between us, heavy in a way I could not immediately define. I did not respond right away. I simply looked at him, realizing that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer about testing or curiosity. It had shifted into something neither of us had fully named, and neither of us seemed ready to walk away from.